On the evening of October 11th, 1973, along a quiet stretch of the Pascagoula River in southern Mississippi, two working-class men stepped into a darkness that no police report, no scientific study, and no government agency has ever been able to fully explain. What began as a routine fishing trip became one of the most psychologically convincing abduction cases in American history. A story so strange, so emotionally raw, and so consistently told that it has haunted law enforcement, researchers, and skeptics for more than 50 years. Unlike so many UFO claims, this was not a tale born from tabloids or fringe culture. It came from a police station, from tape recordings, and from two men who were visibly traumatized, shaking, crying, and terrified when they first told their story. One of them would spend the rest of his life trying to forget what happened. The other would spend the rest of his life trying to prove it was real. This is the story of Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, and the night the Pascagoula River became the center of a mystery that still refuses to die. Charles Hickson was 42 years old in 1973. He was a foreman at a local shipyard, a tough, outspoken man who worked with heavy machinery, supervised crews, and lived a straightforward, blue-collar life. He was known among co-workers as practical and blunt, not someone prone to fantasy or exaggeration. He had never shown any interest in UFOs, science fiction, or paranormal phenomena. In fact, friends later said he had openly mocked such ideas before the incident. Calvin Parker, on the other hand, was just 19 years old, a painfully shy, deeply religious young man who had recently begun working at the shipyard under Hickson's supervision. Parker had a reputation for being quiet, emotionally sensitive, and nervous in social situations. He did not drink much, had no criminal history, and lived a sheltered life in a conservative Mississippi town. What would later make his testimony especially compelling is that Parker hated attention. He would go on to spend decades refusing interviews and trying to stay out of the public eye. These were not men seeking fame. They were not UFO enthusiasts. They were two ordinary workers who simply went fishing after a long day at work. On the evening of October 11th, Hickson and Parker drove to an old pier along the Pascagoula River, a quiet, dark stretch of water surrounded by marshland and trees. The sun was setting. The air was still. They were sitting on the pier, fishing and talking, when something completely out of place shattered the calm. They heard a strange whirring and humming sound coming from above, not like an airplane or a helicopter, but something smooth, mechanical, and eerily controlled. When they looked up, they saw a bright, oval-shaped craft, glowing with bluish light, hovering silently just above the treetops. It was about 30 feet long and had no visible wings or propellers. Before either man could react, a beam of intense blue light shot down from the craft and enveloped them. Instantly, both men were paralyzed. They could not move. They could not scream. They could not run. 3 figures emerged from the craft and floated toward them. What Hickson and Parker described next would become one of the most bizarre and unsettling creature reports in UFO history. The beings were about 5 feet tall, with gray, wrinkled skin that looked almost like elephant hide. They had no visible eyes, no mouths, and no noses, only strange slits where facial features should be. Their arms ended in crab-like claw hands, and instead of walking, they seemed to float just above the ground, as if guided by invisible force. They were not aggressive. They were not emotional. They were not curious. They were mechanical, silent, and purposeful. The beings lifted Hickson and Parker into the air and carried them inside the glowing craft. Once inside, the men were separated. Calvin Parker fainted almost immediately from sheer terror. Hickson remained conscious, and what he experienced would haunt him for the rest of his life. He described being placed against a wall while a large mechanical eye-like device floated in front of him, scanning his body from head to toe. Other devices examined his ears, mouth, and genitals. Everything was cold, precise, and clinical, as if he were being inspected by machines rather than living beings. The entities never spoke. They never reacted. They simply observed. After several minutes, though it felt much longer, Hickson was returned to the riverbank, where he found Parker already lying on the pier in shock. The craft lifted silently into the sky and disappeared. Still trembling and barely able to process what had happened, Hickson and Parker drove straight to the Pascagoula Police Department. They didn't go home. They didn't call friends. They went to the authorities. Officers immediately noticed something strange. The men were not acting like pranksters or hoaxers. They were terrified. Parker was crying uncontrollably. Hickson was shaking. Both appeared deeply traumatized. The police secretly recorded them in a room, expecting them to drop the act. They never did. Instead, the men prayed, cried, and begged God for protection. Behavior that convinced even skeptical officers that something profoundly disturbing had happened to them. Both men were later subjected to polygraph examinations. Charles Hickson passed. Calvin Parker passed. The examiners concluded that neither man showed signs of deception. Whatever they experienced, they believed it was real. Calvin Parker would suffer severe PTSD, anxiety, and depression. He avoided publicity and even attempted suicide years later. He simply wanted to forget. Charles Hickson never changed his story. He spent his life defending what happened, until his death in 2011. Today, a Mississippi historical marker stands at the site. It reads that something unexplained happened there. Were they abducted by something not of this world? Or did something else, something still beyond human understanding, take them that night? The most terrifying part isn't what they saw. It's that every test said the same thing. They were not lying.